So today's event then is on protecting vulnerable coastal communities from climate change-driven coastal change. We're really pleased to be joined by our speaker today, who is Jo Perry. Jo is a project manager with the Highland Council. Jo's led on a variety of nature projects, and his two professional passions are nature enrichment and community welfare. So Jo will be presenting for about 25 minutes, half an hour today, and then after his presentation, there'll be a chance for questions from everyone in the audience. So there is a Q&A function within Zoom that we would ask you to pose your questions into. You could do this throughout the session or save them till the end. And then I'll be asking these on your behalf later on. And as well, if people would like to make use of the chat function throughout as well to share any thoughts or comments, questions for other attendees, then yes, please do. And yeah, excited, as I say, that this is our last event for the project. And yeah, with that, I will hand over to Jo now. So thank you to everyone for joining.
So as Jo mentioned, I'm a project manager with the Highland Council, and today I'm going to introduce a case study to you to illustrate some of those themes that I've just mentioned, coastal adaptation and the threats faced by more isolated and rural communities. So the case study I'm going to introduce to you is a village which I would imagine many of you haven't heard of, so it's the village of Golspie. So Golspie is a small, rural and coastal village in the county of Sutherland. So Sutherland is the least densely populated part of the UK, the least densely populated county. And it's one of the most sparsely populated parts of Western Europe. And in addition to facing a lot of the challenges that all small, rural, coastal communities are facing these days, this village is facing a real existential threat from rising sea levels, from storm surges, and from erosion, all of which, of course, is exacerbated by climate change. So I'll introduce that case study to you, focusing initially on the threat that it's facing, and then I'm going to introduce you to Climate Action Coastlines, which is our project, which is seeking to find nature-based solutions to some of those challenges. So I can see the slides are just coming up there. Thanks very much for doing that. And I'll just say next slide, please, when I'm ready to move on. So I think this title page where you can see the village of Golspie there, you can see how low lying it is. You can see how close it is to the waves. And this is on a calm day where we're not having storm surges. You can see the kind of risk that this village might be facing when we're getting the kind of sea level rise, which is anticipated in particular with under a high emission scenario. So can we go to the next slide, please? Now, if you haven't been, Golspie is a really beautiful village. It's situated, you can see on the map there, it's about 90 minutes north of Inverness if you're in the car, about 3 hours if you're taking public transport. And we'll talk about some of those issues a little bit later. On one side, you've got the North Sea, and then on the other side, you've got the 400-metre hill Ben Braggy. Now, passing through the village, there's some really vital transport infrastructure. So we've got the only railway line and the main trunk road serving the whole of Caithness and much of Sutherland. And for people who are not flying, that's also the only way that you can get up to Orkney. You can see the Orkney Isles just off the top, just off the north coast from Thurso there. So Golspie is a planned village, and it was created as part of the Highland clearances, which is something I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later on. So while the village itself is very small, it's regionally really important, not just for those transport links, but it's got a regionally important hospital and also a very important secondary school. Just to focus on the health infrastructure briefly, there are very, very few hospitals north of Inverness, and the only maternity unit in the whole of Caithness is facing closure. So I've got a colleague of mine who lives right on the north coast, just to the west of Thurso, who had to drive for 3.5 hours when she went into labour. And so when we're talking about some of the threats faced by coastal and rural communities, a lot of these are sort of the infrastructure threats, where these communities are becoming depopulated, the populations are shrinking, because people don't feel that these are livable spaces anymore. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the population of Golspie is small, and it skews older than the general UK population. It's not a particularly wealthy place. Indeed, the Office for National Statistics ranks it below the UK average across a range of economic factors, including average income, average disposable household income, and also for productivity. But that's not particularly unusual for a small rural coastal community. What this area does have, however, is a really strong sense of community spirit and good engagement with local issues, including around flooding. So the picture you can see on the right there, these are local volunteers repairing flood damage, which has happened to a golf course, which is right on the coastline. You can't see the sea, but it's just to the right of this picture. So I think there's a lot going for the Golspie community, but there are also some incredible challenges being faced by the local community. Can we go to the next page, please? So as I mentioned earlier on, these small, isolated, rural communities such as Golspie are facing a lot of threats these days. Many of them, and Golspie is no different, have shrinking and aging populations. They're often far removed from essential services and facilities, and also from job opportunities. But on top of these threats, there's a segment of these villages and other communities which are facing an existential threat from sea level rise, from erosion, and from the impact of storm surges. I think we've perhaps become slightly immune to seeing pictures of freshwater flooding on the news. You'll often see rivers bursting their banks, the same towns flooding every year, and a lot in the north of England and other parts of the UK. But for coastal communities such as Golspie, the sight of seawater in their high streets, which is what you can see on the image on the left there, is becoming worryingly frequent. Can we go to the next page, please? So Golspie already has fairly substantial, but slightly old, flood defences. You can see the flood defences marked in red there. So I'm sorry the lines are a little bit small, but the red lines, those are the existing flood defences. I think this picture also gives a good idea of the scale of Golspie and its relationship with the coastline, so how close everything is to the coastline. And if you look closely, you can sort of make out the main high street, the largest road running from the left of the image through to the right. So the flood infrastructure that we already have, those bits marked in red there, is traditional, trusted, and grey. And we'll have a look at it on the next slide. If we go to the next slide, please. So these defences, these are the existing defences that we have. I'll go around clockwise from the top left. So you've got the rock breakwaters, steel floodgates at the backs of people's gardens, beach renourishment. This is where we add sand, stone, and other sediment after a storm event has washed away part of the beach. Rock revetments and rock gabions protecting certain elements further down the coast. And then also a sea wall, which was built to protect the high street, although you'll have noted from the previous slide that it's not always entirely effective. So these defences have helped to mitigate the impacts of flood events thus far. But we now know, as we gain a greater understanding of coastal change modelling and the impacts of climate change, we know that this is not going to be enough in the near future. We could go to the next slide, please. So the Highland Council, who I work for, have been looking at options for Golspie for a number of years now. In 2019, we brought in a infrastructure consulting firm, AECOM, for a flood protection study. And this study found that the do nothing option really wasn't an option, as the existing defences are going to deteriorate and would soon not be able to cope with the future climate reality. Some options, such as a traditional breakwater or beach renourishment, had minimal impacts when it came to flood protection. Raising the seawall would provide decent short-term flood protection for one part of the coast, but this idea was unpalatable to many residents who were concerned about the visual impact on the seafront. And hearing that, you might think that the visual impact is a small price to pay if you're securing sort of flood protection for an important part of the village. And it's maybe something we can discuss later in the Q&A, but people's connection to place, their sense of place, their reasons for loving the place that they live in, those are really important factors which we have to consider when we're looking at coastal flood management. Can we go to the next page, please? So 2 years after that Golspie flood study came Dynamic Coast, which is a superb project which undertook a wide range of analysis to improve the evidence base and our awareness of coastal change in Scotland, and also to advocate for adaptation. I've highlighted some of the main findings on the screen there. So you can see today's 200-year event becomes a 75-year event by 2050 and a 10-year event by 2080. So just to make that clearer, an event which at the moment is of a severity that it only happens once every 200 years, we will soon expect to happen every 10 years. That's an enormous difference. That's an enormous difference for safety. It's an enormous difference for insurance, and it's an enormous difference when it comes to cleanup costs. Also the erosion rates. If you had a look at the images of Golspie, the aerial images, you can see here that a maximum coastal erosion rate might include 330 meters of retreat by the end of the century. And you'll have seen from those pictures that Golspie doesn't have 330 meters of retreat available to it. The recommendations were also quite stark. If you look at the first recommendation, the bit in bold, asset relocation or abandonment, these are really scary, really emotive ideas. And the suggestion there is that Golspie, as we know it today, is really at risk of not being able to function. Now, I first gave a talk similar to this about a month ago at Coastal Futures, and following on from that talk, I was contacted by Dr. Ben Hudson from Exeter University, and he spoke to me about how I framed the existential threat that Golspie was facing. And in my talk, I was describing the village as it is today as unviable. And our conversation really made me rethink it, because the case that he made, and I agree with this, is that in a place such as Golspie, flooding events and the severity of those events is likely to increase. But there will be people who still choose to live there, people who love the area, or people who are, for whatever reason, unable to move. Maybe it's a financial reason. They can't sell their home, and so they can't afford to move out somewhere else. Maybe they've got a connection to the land, which means that even though the risk is getting higher, the costs are getting higher, they still choose to stay. So using words such as unviable is not really the way to speak about places like this. So Golspie will be different. It may be dramatically different, but yes, I'm not using the word unviable anymore. So that was a really helpful discussion. And I think that it is a sort of a relevant point when you look at the quote at the bottom of the slide here. This quote came from the Dynamic Coast sub-report for our area, for the Golspie and Cool region. And this is what I think we need to be doing, is ensuring that management is future smart, if not future proof. So it might not be necessarily possible to solve the some of the threats facing Golspie, but we can still be future smart. We can adapt in a smart way. Can we get to the next page, please? So now I just want to visualize some of the findings from that dynamic coast report, the report I mentioned on the previous page. So they've got this fantastic tool which allows you to look at coastal change around Scotland under different emission scenarios. So this is our starting point, and what you can see here is the mean high water spring at Golspie. This is Golspie again in 2018. So we're now going to look forward into the future under some different emission scenarios. So can we go to the next page, please? Okay, so we've now jumped forward to 2060 if you look at the orange lines, and 2100 if you look at the red line. So this is under a high emission scenario, and when we're planning for future flood defences, I think it's sensible to look at the high emission scenario, or the worst case scenario for how things could be. So you can see here that the mean high water spring is already in people's gardens, approaching the backs of people's houses. These storm surges, where you get these big storm events, would therefore extend well into the village under these scenarios. Can we go to the next page, please? Okay, so on top of the mean high water spring, moving further up, we're also going to have erosion under all emission scenarios, but particularly under a high emission scenario. So here we have 2050, where you can see that erosion has entirely severed the high street as it is today. So the village would already be looking incredibly different, and a lot of adaptation would have had to happen before this moment. And now to the next page, please. Okay, and here we have 2100. So this is, again, under a high emission scenario, where clearly the village as it is today would no longer exist as it is today. So the people who are living in Golspie at this time would be living in a very, very different Golspie. Now, this information is publicly available on Dynamic Coast's website. So you can go and have a play around with Dynamic Coast yourself and have a look at different areas of the coastline. However, there are still plenty of people living in places such as Golspie who are not aware of just how bad things could get with climate change driven rising sea levels and with more severe storms. Can we go to the next page, please? So with all of this in mind, I started having a look for some funding opportunities after reading the sub-report for Golspie, and I came across the Scottish Government's Green Growth Accelerator Fund. So this fund supported investments in low carbon infrastructure. We put in an application for nature-based flood defences to protect Golspie and the surrounding area. And we wanted to use Golspie as a case study and then take lessons learned from this project and apply them to similar communities around the Highlands. We were successful in this initial application, and we received £120,000 of Pathfinder funding to investigate our options, build a business case, and carry out some community consultation. So there were 7 Pathfinder projects chosen at this stage, and the Scottish Government would then take some of those to continue to full project funding. So if we can go to the next page, please. So this is how our project Climate Action Coastlines actually got started. So we built a project team. You can see the members of the team at the bottom of the page there, and it has a good balance of technical expertise, local knowledge, and community ties. And then we also started talking to communities about the challenges that Golspie was facing from sea level rise and from storm surges, and how nature-based solutions might be used to tackle these. We knew that awareness might be quite low, not just awareness of the risks being faced, but also awareness about what nature-based solutions are and what kind of an impact that they could have. So we had 3 main aims, which you can see on the screen there. So to identify the right nature-based solutions for Golspie and for other similar villages, to embed community voices at an early stage, and then also to explore ways that green finance might be used to fund future nature-based flood work, not just here, but in other parts of the Highlands as well. So the solutions that we explored included some quite traditional options, so sand dune strengthening, which is sometimes just done by installing fences to hold sand dunes in place, living breakwaters and seawalls. So this is a bit like a normal breakwater or a normal seawall, but you help vegetation to grow on the surfaces that you've installed. So you sort of green a grey solution. So it's still a lot of concrete, but it's a slightly greener option. And then we also looked at some habitat restoration for shellfish, seagrass, and salt marsh. You can probably imagine that in the section right in front of the Golspie High Street, there weren't huge amounts of, for example, salt marshes. So a lot of these changes would be slightly further up or down the coast from Golspie High Street, and also dike construction. We also looked at some more innovative, maybe more challenging adaptation, including managed retreat, where you help a community to plan how they're going to move with the coastline, move with the changing coastline, integrating the advancing coastline with the village of Golspie, and also the idea of setting up local emergency flood task forces to deal with storm events so we can respond to events more quickly, which is also part of adaptation. Can we go to the next page, please? But before I go more into the community work, I wanted to give some more sort of historical and social context for Golspie. I think when we're talking about vulnerable communities, I think this is quite important context to have in mind. So as I mentioned earlier, Golspie was a planned fishing village for people who had been moved, sometimes violently, as part of the Highland clearances. On the right there, sort of a famous painting of the clearances. So the clearances happened across the Highlands and Islands from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. And it consisted of landowners trying to increase their income by eliminating small subsistence farms from their estate land and then replacing them with much larger pastoral farms, mostly with sheep, on which they could charge much higher rents. So the largest landowner in the region, so the region of Golspie, and at the time the richest man in the world, was the Duke of Sutherland. So along with his wife, he oversaw the relocation of tenant farmers from the interior of Sutherland, the county that Golspie's in, to the coast to make a living from fishing. Maybe some of these people knew how to fish, maybe many of them did not. So this was an entirely new skill they were having to learn and moving away from a source of income, which was something they were familiar with. In some cases, the farmers' homes were burnt to prevent reoccupation so that they couldn't return to where they'd been moved from. And there was at least one court case in Sutherland concerning a home being set alight with the occupants still inside. So it was a really, really brutal, really violent period of Scottish history. So the picture in the top left, the smallest picture, is the sort of fairy tale style castle and the ancestral home of the Dukes of Sutherland. It's now open to the public and it's a significant local tourist attraction, but still quite an important reminder of the history and a reminder of the clearances. And then to the right of that, we've got the 100-foot statue of the Duke of Sutherland, which sits on top of the 400-meter Ben Braggy Hill that I mentioned was at the back of the village of Golspie, and it really sort of dominates the local skyline. So he's known locally as the Manny on the Hill, and there are sort of mixed views about this statue. There have been unsuccessful attempts to have the statue torn down, several instances of vandalism, and quite frequent instances of graffiti, including the word monster being written across the statue in big green letters. I think this is important context when we're talking about the vulnerability of communities, like looking at the historic vulnerability of a community. The first inhabitants of this town, the first inhabitants of Golspie, were forced to the coastline to make way for sheep. And now we've got the coastline pushing back on its modern day inhabitants. And we're trying to consider what role that we can play as a local authority, but also with our partners in protecting those communities. Can we go to the next slide, please? So with all of that in mind, it was really important that communities were engaged in this Pathfinder project from the very start. So we held community discussion sessions, and as often as possible, those were community-led. We led coastal walking events. Well, I say we led, it was actually the local community council who led that. A lady called Henrietta, who was featured in one of the pictures on an earlier slide. She's been a very sort of vocal supporter of this project and also a huge advocate for local flood action in the area. And so she was leading those coastal walks to really introduce other members of the community to the risks that the area is facing. We also collected local opinions to online questionnaires, and we brought in the Design Council to run a series of community workshops to collect local views on the future of Golspie. So the Design Council workshops were really interesting. The way that this worked was that the Design Council would invite local stakeholders, local members of the community, and then also wider stakeholders such as the Highland Council, Nature Scot, which is our environment body, and maybe other technical partners as well, some of the universities that we worked with, to a workshop. They would set the ground, do some of the sort of workshop admin at the beginning, and then hand over the workshop to the local community, and then they really take it in the direction that they want to go. And it was a really, really interesting way of getting community voices and hearing more about what local people saw for the area. And often the discussions they're having are quite different to the discussions we're having, for example, in our flood team. So the Highland Council has a flood team. So I've just noted a couple of the talking points that came out there. So ambition and optimism for Golspie's futures. So hearing about the challenges that are coming through climate change related sea level rise and from coastal erosion, still a lot of ambition, a lot of optimism for the region. Secondly, a huge desire to retain the visual character of the village. I actually grew up on a coast myself. I'm in the south of England, and I really understand that connection to coastal views and to the importance of seeing and sort of smelling the sea and the connection that you can have to the land by taking coastal walks in the evening. That's something that's really important. And thirdly, they're an openness to nature-based solutions, but skeptical of performance. So I think there's something quite reassuring about grey flood defences. Building a big sea wall seems like a very, very solid way of dealing with quite a scary problem. And so it's quite understandable that those things are maybe more reassuring and then more favoured by people who live in the area. So I think explaining what nature-based solutions are and how they can help was a really important part of this process. Can we go to the next slide, please? So after a year of community consultation, business case development and project planning, we were unfortunately not selected to go to the next stage of the Green Growth Accelerator funding, although we have been able to secure some smaller grants for research for salt marsh research in the area. We've also retained really good relationships with the project partners, and we're still working on more funding applications with Edinburgh University, St Andrews University. But most importantly, we've built and we've maintained these really strong relationships with the local community. So we're in frequent communication with members of the local community council, with members of the local charities, Go Golspie, regional climate change charity, the North Highlands and Islands Climate Hub. And these connections and these relationships are what are really going to make the difference in the future when we do have access to the funding to come back and do some of this work that needs to be done. Can we go to the next page, please? So Golspie's future, like many similar coastal low-lying villages, is really uncertain. Adaptation to rising sea levels and increased storm surges is essential. And those organisations, such as mine, involved in planning flood defences and adaptation plans, need to try and embed those community voices at every stage of the process, and also ensure that more vulnerable communities are prioritised for funding and for coastal realignment projects where those are available. So I hope you found this case study to be interesting. The idea of this case study is really to start a conversation, because this is just one village, which I think is representative of many similar communities, not just around the Highlands, Scotland or the UK, but around the world. And some of these themes are going to be really similar in these different communities. So I'm really interested to hear some of your questions and having a bit of a discussion. For example, who is responsible for planning and managing this coastal change? When is it acceptable to use public money to protect homes, to protect private businesses even? And then what role are traditional coastal defences going to play in the future? These are all quite interesting topics which I'd be interested to discuss. And then if we can go to the final page, please, which is just to say thank you very much. A historic picture of a flood in Golspie High Street. This is from about 100 years ago. So it's not an entirely new problem, but it's certainly getting worse. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm very interested to hear your questions.
Yeah, really interesting to hear, and I really enjoyed how you kind of explained the social and historical context, as well as, talking us through the whole kind of journey of the project and the work you've been doing. So thank you very much. All right, so we now have some time for Q&A with the audience. We have had a few questions that have come through already, which is great. So yeah, I will be asking those, and if people have got more, then please do share them, and yeah, we'll see what we've got time to get to. So somebody has asked, what do you think were some of the key success factors in building strong relationships with local communities that could be replicated in other areas?
So I think one of the smartest things that we did really early on was accepting that we might not be the best people to start that conversation. So a theme in the north of the Highlands is that environmental work and community work is often imposed on the area rather than developed with local communities. So you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not, and I mentioned it in the talk, I'm not from the area. And even something like that can provide a little bit of a barrier to getting started. So one of the things we did really early on was we reached out to a local charity that was in the area. So this one's called Go Golspie. So this is a charity that's based in the village of Golspie, serves the wider region in Sutherland as well, and they've already got those connections with the local community. So we went to them and we asked if they would help to facilitate some of our community engagement work. We also approached the North Highlands Climate Hub, which is a Scottish government initiative. There are hubs in different parts of Scotland, and we asked if they would lead on a sort of climate science awareness series of outreach events. And so the voices that they were hearing in these community consultations were voices of people who have grown up and lived in the same area of them. And I think that is really very helpful, because if you turn up to talk about a solution and you're coming from the council, you're clearly coming from a different area. So from their perspective, you're coming up from Inverness, and if you're in Golspie, Inverness is the south. So you're sort of coming up from the south, and you don't have the same problems that they've got in their area, and it does create that slight barrier. So what I would say is look for local advocates and local champions right at the start, and then see if they can help to lead some of those community engagement events. That's what I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Yes, some great insights there. Okay, so our next question, how is the Highland Council looking at this whole issue now, particularly in light of the work at Golspie?
Well, the Highland Council, like many local authorities, is facing some real financial difficulties. So we're not one of the local authorities that has declared bankruptcy, but all local authorities are facing tight budgets. The scale of the challenge is so vast when we look at coastal defence, when we look at flood defences for coastal regions, and also pluvial flooding, so for freshwater flooding. The scale is so vast that the Highland Council cannot solve these problems on its own. And I think I mentioned in the talk that it's not even really about solving problems. It's not about solving coastal flooding. It's about adapting with the changing coastline, adapting with the changing environment. And I think that's where the Highland Council's focus is. We're a project partner in a really fantastic project, which you can go and have a look at. It's called Highland Adapts. So Highland Adapts is not only looking at some of the environmental hazards that are coming with a changing climate, but also looking at really interesting things such as food production. The Highland region is sort of a big food production hub, lots of agricultural activity in the region, and Highland Adapts, one of the things it's doing is looking at what types of crops we'll be able to grow in the future. So if you're a farmer, you tend not to look just to next year, you tend to look very far ahead. Maybe you think you're going to pass down the farm to the next generation, and then they'll pass it to the next generation. So we're engaging with a lot of different stakeholders on that. And one of the pieces of work that Highland Adapts is doing is looking at coastal change. Now, the Highland Council, like all local authorities in the Highlands, is going to be producing a coastal change adaptation plan and also a local adaptation plan this year. So I'd say that's something to keep an eye out for. So I think these plans are going to include a big focus on adaptation. There will still be a role for traditional grey flood defences in some areas. However, I'm hoping that nature-based solutions are going to increasingly play an important role in our national flood response.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jo. And if you've got any sort of links that you can share about that Highland Adapt project, then
Yeah, sure.
either you can drop in the chat or send them to me and then share it with
Sure. Yeah.
afterwards. Yeah, it sounds very interesting. But yeah, got lots more questions. So unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to get to all of them, but do our best to get through as many. So somebody has asked, are there many young people in Golspie? And how has the project ensured they are engaged in the future vision for their community?
So there are not a huge number of young people in Golspie, partly because it's a small community, partly because a lot of people retire to the Highlands, so the average age is quite high. However, Golspie does have one of the few high schools in the region. Many of those are bussed in from surrounding communities. So during the day and on school days, there are lots of young people in Golspie, although not all of them live in the area. From the community engagement events I went to, the average age probably reflected the average age of Golspie. It was much older. And I don't know if it's just a situation with the Highlands, but when you do community engagement events, community consultations, the response rate for young people is really low. So we did all the traditional things you do when you're thinking about how to engage with young people. We put everything on social media, but I think it still has a limited impact. And I think part of that comes from the highest level of engagement we had was from people who had a connection to the region, a connection to the village. And I think that's something that develops as you get older, as you spend more time in a place. I think young people are huge advocates for action on climate change. But when it comes to connection to a particular region, connection to a particular piece of land or the way that something looks now, maybe that's something that appeals to older people. So we did try and engage with young people, but I can't say we were particularly successful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, really interesting to hear. Okay, I think this is going to have to be the last question then before we wrap things up. So, is the insurance industry taking note and were they involved? I would be interested to know if they see themselves as part of the solution.
Yeah, insurance is a huge challenge for this, and I can recommend reading The Uninsurable Planet. So I can send a link to that as well. I'll send it to Highland Adapt as well. So insurance is an issue that's going to be an enormous challenge in the future. There are certain regions around the Highlands where insurance is going to become an increasing problem due to climate change. So it's not just flood risks. There's been a series of fires in the north of the Highlands as well. And the rate of wildfires has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. This is something you've probably seen in other parts of the world as well. Climate change is making insurance adapt as well. So one way in which the insurance industry is adapting is that they're putting prices up for certain regions, but there will come a time where certain homes, certain properties, certain businesses become uninsurable. They were not involved in this project. However, our flood team does engage with the insurance sector when they're looking at sort of the coastal change adaptation plans and local flood risk plans as well. So not for this particular project, but it is something that local authorities do consider.
Great, thank you. That's yeah, really good to know, and yeah, definitely an interesting sounding book as well. So thank you for the recommendation on that. Okay, so yeah, that is about everything we've got time for today. So apologies to everyone whose questions that we weren't able to get to. But yeah, it's been a really great session. So thank you so much, Jo, for your time and for yeah, a presentation and answering the questions that we've had through.